Happy What's Your Read Day, everybody. It's always great to be here. And how you doing, Jason?
I'm doing well, Troy. How are you?
Doing well. So today, on the day that we're recording this episode, is the day of George Floyd's burial. So there's a lot going on, a lot of emotional, pain going across the country. But what the President of the United States is up to, while the rest of the country is mourning George Floyd. This is the third service. There was a service in the town in North Carolina where he grew up, or where he was born, I should say. There was also obviously the service in Minneapolis that Reverend Al Sharpton did the eulogy for, and now there's a service in Houston, which is where his family is from and where his family still lives. On the day that's happening, Donald Trump on Twitter, doing what he does, which is tweet a whole bunch of crazy stuff, tweets about the Buffalo protester. Now, I don't know if you guys have seen this video. Everyone's seen this video of the 75-year-old white man who gets bodied by a police officer in Buffalo, New York. He gets bodied to the ground. His head cracks open. He starts bleeding on the sidewalk, and all the other officers just walk over him. Oh, there's one officer who turns, is like, "Hey, maybe we should pick him up," and they're like, "No, keep going." And they just kind of walk over the guy.
I think that officer was one of the guys who pushed him down, who tries oh my God, I think he heard him, and turn around and supervise nope.
I don't know if it was him or another guy. I just know one guy did turn around ooh, maybe I should pick him up. And they were like, "No, just keep going." And so what ended up happening was that the officers, and we talked about this on another episode, the two who were involved in shoving the guy and telling everybody to ignore the guy, those guys have been suspended. The entire unit, all 57 members of that, it's like a detail that they use for, to sort of security events. They all resigned from that detail. They didn't resign from the police force because they still want their pensions. But they resigned from that in protest. How dare you criticize us? But anyway, Donald Trump decided to talk about this Buffalo protester. And this is what he said about him. Okay, but this is your president. Buffalo protester shoved by police could be an Antifa provocateur. 75-year-old Martin Gugino was pushed away after appearing to scan police communications in order to black out the equipment. OANN, and OANN is a wacky news network that he watched. I watched. He fell harder than he was pushed. Was aiming scanner. Could it be a setup? Da 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 da.
And he's serious, I suppose.
And he's absolutely serious. Meanwhile, William Barr, his attorney general / consigliere / the hand of the king, he is like a straight up Game of Thrones character, went on Fox News, of course, to tell Fox News that he is really focusing his investigation that relate to Antifa. This is like a made-up thing. So there is a such thing as Antifa. It's called anti-fascist. I've always said that every time the media writes about Antifa, they should say the whole thing. Because if Donald Trump says we're going to declare Antifa to be a terrorist group, media should read it as we are going to declare anti-fascists to be a terrorist group. Because see how silly that sounds? Antifa are just people who oppose fascism. They dress in black and they punch Nazis. When they see fascist groups and neo-Nazis show up, they show up. And they show up and they fight them and they punch them. But they are the terrorist group, apparently. The Ku Klux Klan, not so much. Who knew? The Klan is not a terrorist group in the United States.
No, those are fine people.
Very fine people. The people who marched in Charlottesville, according to Donald Trump, those include very fine people. So there's a weird thing that's happening, a weird sort of dichotomy between what's really happening in the world and what Donald Trump is pretending happening. Josh Marshall with a good tweet on this. He tweeted, "Antifa, we're going to flood the zone with senior citizens for police to knock over and bleed out of their ears." Genius plan. Genius plan. There's also an election on the day that we're recording today. Georgia and several other states voting. And of course, machines are broken. Voter suppression. Because the thing is that what you've got in the United States right now is that you've got a knockdown, drag out fight to keep Donald Trump and the people who have enabled him in power, no matter what they've done, no matter what has happened, no matter how much pain has it. There is a fight to keep them in power, no matter what. Ezra Klein tweeted, if that's the theory he comes up with when a 75-year-old protester is shoved to the ground, imagine what he'll say and what he'll try to get his supporters to do, this is Trump, if he loses the election by 3,000 votes in Wisconsin. Something to think about something to think about. Reports as many as 25 plus Gwinnett County precincts did not even have machines or any other equipment up and ready to go at 7 a.m., which is the time people are showing up to vote.
I guess they forgot they had an election that day.
I guess they forgot they had an election. In Georgia, where there are 2 United States Senate seats up, we actually know someone running, Teresa Tomlinson, friend of ours, friend of the show, the AM Joy show, but also a friend of Jason and mine, is running. So go Teresa. Hopefully she will do well. She's running for one of the 2 seats. Also, the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church is also running. So you got lots of that going on. That's happening. Now, when United States senators, Republicans, were asked about what Donald Trump said, guess what they did? Do you want to take a guess, Jason, what they said?
Did they even stop, or did they just carry on walking by like they didn't hear anything?
Remember the Benny Hill theme? Yeah, I think every time we show, or talk about them, that theme should actually play. Because what they've done is they've run away and said, "Oh, I didn't read Twitter." You didn't read Twitter?
No, you were just told to be obedient by your boss.
Yeah, I don't know what he said. I don't know anything about it. So they're all running around and running away and fleeing. Here's John Harwood tweeting, formerly worked at CNBC, my former colleague who's now over at CNN. GOP senators ducking on Trump's deranged tweet about elderly Buffalo man to my colleague, to Manu Raju. Rubio, of course. I didn't see it. You're telling me about it. I don't read Twitter. I only write on it. John Cornyn of Texas, who's up for re-election. A lot of this stuff just goes over my head. That one should be read in the Elmer Fudd voice. I can't do an Elmer Fudd voice this morning, but that Cornyn tweet should definitely be read in the voice of Elmer Fudd. A lot of this stuff, it just goes over my head.
The funny thing about it is I really do wonder if they think that we believe them.
You know what? I think what's going to happen, somebody tweeted this morning a really sort of a poignant thought, which I think is probably true. 5 years from now, it's going to be very difficult to find a Trump supporter. Because if you think about it, how many people do you know that brag that they voted for George Wallace? Like, they don't. Apparently nobody voted for George Wallace, but he got like 19% of the vote or something when he ran for president. But people will quickly forget that this ever happened. Marco Rubio, 5 years from now, will be trying to represent himself as a constitutional conservative. Ted Cruz, who was humiliated by Trump. Humiliated. He called his wife ugly. He called his father a murderer. But Ted Cruz is now the biggest suck up to Donald Trump, other than Rand Paul and Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio, and all of them, really. Everyone except for Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney actually said of that same exact tweet that it's undignified. He won't even give it dignity. So he actually commented on it because you know why? Because he's running. You know Mitt Romney's going to run for president in 2024.
No, that's right.
He's going to run in 2024, and he's going to run as a normal Republican. And all of these Republicans who are right now Trumpers, who are running behind Donald Trump like he's the ice cream truck in the neighborhood when you were a kid, that are running behind him like it's going ding, 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 and they want ice cream, they're all going to turn tail and run behind Romney and pretend that they've never changed.
I actually don't think they may do that. I think this might be the end of the Republican Party altogether.
I don't know. I know a lot of people like your Michael Steeles of the world are really fighting to preserve the Republican Party as they knew it before and still want to reform the Republican Party. You can't clean
that kind of shit off of you.
Yeah, but I mean, I think one of two things is going to happen to the Republican Party. I think you'll either see the Republican Party just collapse and become a rump party that'll still be called the Republican Party but won't have a lot of membership, or it will retain the way that the Nationalist Party retained in South Africa, but another party will come along that will become the Conservative Party, and it'll have to fight with that party. There's already a Libertarian Party, which is, not really that useful to the world and doesn't really do a whole lot, but I can see somebody creating a different party and saying, now this is where Republicans, never Trumper type Republicans could go. Or they'll just reform the Republican Party and pretend this never happened. I think the third thing will happen. I think a lot of Republicans, when Donald Trump, they will get amnesia. They'll pretend they never did the things they did. They'll pretend the kids were never locked up in cages. They'll pretend they never looked aside as fascists marched through Charlottesville and killed Heather Heyer. They'll pretend they never looked away when there was a massacre in a church in South Carolina, and this was during the Obama era, and they mostly, said they were so outraged, et cetera, but did nothing to try to curb the rise of the alt-right among young white Americans. They'll pretend none of this ever happened. They'll just pretend it was fine.
That's why it's the duty of the American people to make sure they never forget
Right.
and vote them out of office.
And people have to remember. And the thing is, you think about the people who are up right now. Mitch McConnell is up. Lindsey Graham is up for re-election.
Bye, Mitch.
And the thing is the question is, do the American people have enough of a memory to last 5 months, not 5 years? And whether or not seats that seem so safe. You know, Mike Espy's running in Mississippi. The woman he's running against, the sitting senator right now, is the same woman that he ran into a runoff with and got really close to winning, who said that she would be front seat at a hanging. That she, you know, basically she joked about lynching, and she's a United States senator. Like, the Republican Party has basically taken in all of what the Dixiecrats used to be. They brought it on board, and they're rolling with it with Donald Trump, who isn't even a Dixiecrat because, yeah, he's an ex-Democrat, but he's from New York. So it's a weird thing that's happened to the Republican Party. It is almost unrecognizable unless you remember the George Wallace wing of the Democratic Party, because the Republican Party of today is almost identical to the George Wallace wing of the Democratic Party in the 1950s and 60s.
Except for this time, they don't believe in states' rights.
Except this time, they don't believe in states' rights. They don't believe in states' rights when it comes to the state's right to protect people disproportionately brown and black from COVID. Exactly. They don't believe in the state's right to protect people from a disease. And they suddenly do believe in imposing military power on states, which, ironically enough, used to be the thing that presidents used to protect black people. If you go back and you look at the history of the military being used in the United States, the National Guard. The National Guard was used by Eisenhower, was used by Kennedy, was used by Lyndon Johnson, not to terrorize black and brown people and protesters, but actually to march, to walk black children into school, Little Rock High School. You know, reluctantly, but he did. Eisenhower sent the National Guard to protect those little kids, the little Ruby Bakers who wanted to go to school. Sent them to the universities of Mississippi, the University of Mississippi, to allow black students to walk into the University of Mississippi. They walked in under the protection of the National Guard. So for Donald Trump to flip that history of sending in the United States military into states where it traditionally had been to protect the victims of racial discrimination and hate, to walk black kids into school, into college, into elementary school. That's what the military did. To send them in his idea to fire rubber bullets and tear gas and own the street, to dominate the streets. It's wild. It's really wild. And you know, I was thinking about Donald Trump this week, that the thing he reminds me the most of, and Jason, I don't know if you'll agree with this, the person that Donald Trump reminds me the most of, it's as if he has modeled his presidency after the mayoralty of Rudy Giuliani. Mm-hmm. It's very Giuliani-esque. This is what it was like to live in New York under Giuliani, right? If you think about it, David Dinkins gets elected the first New York City black mayor of New York City. He comes in, and the first thing he does is he starts police reforms. He starts requiring that the NYPD do foot patrols in communities, do community policing.
Live in the neighborhoods where they patrol.
Exactly. And a lot of police officers who may patrol in Brooklyn don't live in Brooklyn.
Staten Island.
They live in Staten Island, and they come into Brooklyn. They're like Giuliani. Giuliani was born in Brooklyn, but never set foot in Brooklyn when he was mayor. They live in Staten Island. They live in all white communities where there aren't black people and where black people aren't necessarily welcome. And then they go to work in Brooklyn and in Queens and in neighborhoods where they consider those people to be a bunch of criminals or criminals in waiting. They'll be a criminal if they're not a criminal now. And so they police there, and then they go back to Staten Island. What Mayor David Dinkins wanted was that people live in the community and police from the community, that you recruit police from the community, and that they walk the streets, they walk a beat in the community the way that they did in Mayberry. Why was Mayberry's police force so friendly toward the people of Mayberry and non-threatening toward the people of Mayberry?
Because they knew who they were.
They knew who they were. Because the sheriffs and the police officers in Mayberry knew all the people who lived in Mayberry. So if somebody in Mayberry, if a teenager in Mayberry, robbed from a store, they could take them by the ear and walk them back home to their mom because they knew where they lived. And also, well, they were all white, so of course there was no racial conflict that was introduced. That was not involved in Mayberry. Mayberry was an all-white community. It was a fictional community. But that's the point. If you live in the neighborhood, then even if a kid goes wrong and they do something wrong, you know them. You can say, oh, that's Joe. I know Joe. Joe's not a bad kid. He just made a mistake. Let me walk him home to his mom. Let's talk to her. Let's talk to his dad. Let's try to get things together. And you don't have to be so punitive and violent and cruel. And that's what Dinkins wanted. When Mayor Dinkins tried, and when he even tried to manage the racial unrest that was going on in the community, because remember back then, there was a lot of racial unrest between the Korean American community, the black community, the Jewish community. These communities were all at odds. They were all fighting. There was even a riot, in Crown Heights, a racial riot over, racial conflict. He tried to manage it. Giuliani came in and said, nah, let the police bust heads.
Exactly.
Let the police do whatever they want.
Matter of fact, I remember when the police down at One Police Plaza, when Dinkins was there and Giuliani, I think he had the nomination or whatever, or whatever it was that he was going to be the next mayor, that they basically had a riot.
They rioted.
They had a riot down. The police had a riot.
The police actually rioted against David Dinkins.
Yes,
Look it
did.
up. The police. There's a movie called Giuliani Time. Giuliani Time is a film that you can rent. I think you can get it on Netflix. And it talks about Giuliani's rise to power. Now, Giuliani's father allegedly was involved in underworld sort of activity, and he comes along and he becomes this like super law and order guy. And he runs against Dinkins, essentially accusing the black mayor of allowing black criminals to take over New York and ruin New York. He runs and he tells the police, I will be your guy. I will let you do the real work and take the gloves off. It's going to sound like Trump. Literally, police opposing the reforms that Mayor David Dinkins wanted to put in literally rioted. They marched down to One Police Plaza, and Jason, you're absolutely right. They rioted. The police did. And eventually, the whites...
They got their way.
They got their way. The suburbs, the majority white suburbs elect Giuliani.
They pouted and got their way.
Elect Giuliani mayor. Giuliani becomes mayor, and he let the police just run wild. You had the Amadou Diallo situation where they emptied more than 40 bullets into a West African immigrant, killed him, and got away with it. You had the Patrick Dorismond situation where a black man who was minding his own business, an undercover cop, comes up to him and asks him, does he have weed? He says, I don't have weed. He insists you must have weed because he's black. And of course, you got to have weed. If you're black, you're obviously a drug dealer. And he annoys him so much that he shoves the officer. The officer takes out his gun and kills him. Giuliani, rather than empathize with this completely ridiculous, out-of-the-box, random murder of a black man by an undercover police officer, he releases Patrick Dorismond's juvenile record because he had like a shoplifting charge or something when he was like 15 or 16. He releases that to show, well, he's no altar boy. Narrator, he literally was an altar boy. The guy was literally an altar boy. And I think he was an altar boy in the exact same parish as Rudy Giuliani. So the idea is that Giuliani's attitude was that the police can do no wrong. They are not to be questioned. If they kill someone, the person probably deserved to die. Donald Trump came up in Giuliani's New York, right? He was living, he's a New Yorker. So he lived through the Dinkins era and the Giuliani era. And he clearly preferred the Giuliani era because he's recreating it as president. Donald Trump says things like police should take the gloves off. They shouldn't be so nice. They shouldn't be so gentle putting people into cars when they're trying not to bang the person's head into the roof of the car. No, go ahead, bang their head. He talks about protesters that, back in the day, they would have gotten beat up basically, and encourages his supporters to be violent toward protesters. So Donald Trump is just being Donald Trump. And the things that he's doing are not different really from the way Rudy Giuliani ran New York City. He's now running the United States the way Giuliani ran New York City. I think that's pretty clear. Hopefully he won't get a second term like Giuliani did, but that is the way that he's operating. And so it's interesting to watch him recreate Giulianiism in the White House. But what's also interesting is that, like Giuliani, Donald Trump has a following that is, it is almost religious, the way that Trump followers, Trump supporters adore him.
But the majority of his followers are religious, right? And
they are religious, right? And not even just religious, yeah. There are very conservative Jewish supporters, but the majority of them are very right-wing Christians. White Christians.
Yes, ma'am.
Because, black Christians are not down with that. But this is what he has sort of cultivated around him. And I have always seen it as, and written in the books I've written about that, to deal with him. The one book I've written about that deals with him is that a lot of it is about demographic panic. That it's about the panic that black and brown people are taking over. But there's also something else to it. There's something that is sort of desperate about this need to believe everything Donald Trump says. That, is it Fox News that's making it so, is it Fox News because they're selling it so hard? Is it the, Breitbarts of the world? Is it that people are just ingesting Trumpism and that's why it's so powerful? It's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. And it's the focus of this episode of What to Read. We have a cool guest that we're going to talk to about that. So let's bring him in.
Let's do it.
And joining me now is somebody I am very, very excited to talk with, Steven Hassan, who's written a book called The Cult of Trump. A leading cult expert explains how the president uses mind control. And just so that you can get a sense of how much of an expert that Steven is, he's also written a book called Freedom of Mind, which also talks about the sort of cult phenomenon and combating cult mind control, which is the #1 best-selling guide to protecting, rescuing, and recovering people from deconstructive cults. Steven Hassan, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
So we were talking a little bit about you, and first of all, I started to mispronounce your name as Hassan because that's what it looks like on paper. But just tell us a little bit about that, because it's Hassan. You're Jewish, but you have a name that most people associate with being Arab or Muslim. That must have been fun growing up.
It was intense. I should say I grew up 1.3 miles from Donald Trump on the poor side of Union Turnpike. But I grew up in a conservative Jewish family and was harassed by Jews who thought I was a Muslim and harassed by people when they found that I was a Jew. And after 9/11, I couldn't get on an airplane without several security pat-downs and triple checks and everything.
Yeah, the story of America is a story not just of immigration, but of this mix of all of these nationalities around the world, where sometimes in coming in, names were changed, or people would just change their names when they were here. And you were telling me a little bit about that there's an Ellis Island part to the story of how your last name is Hassan. That's really the way that America was built, right? Sometimes it was built by mistakes at Ellis Island, in nomenclature, or attempting to quote unquote Americanize people who were coming from other countries. That part of what America is what a lot of people like my family that were immigrants were attracted to, right? The idea that you could come to America and sort of be someone else, restart your life, start a new life. There's a beauty to that. If you look aside from the racism and anti-blackness and enslavement, and you look just at that part of it, it is interesting to me that Donald Trump does not seem to see that beauty. He doesn't seem to see that about America. Do you find him, you said you grew up near him, what do you make of his attitude toward America?
Oh boy. So his roots, his family name should be Drumpf.
Yes.
Drumpf, but it doesn't sound as royal as Trump. Oh boy. So the bottom line is I'm a New Yorker, and so I was exposed to Donald Trump as a glitzy playboy, high roller, whatever, and I watched The Apprentice for 10 minutes and I was like, oh my God, I can't stand this. And I didn't take him seriously until I saw some presidential primary debates. And then when he came out with this statement in 2015 that he wanted a total Muslim ban, I had been heavily researching ISIS recruitment online. And I wrote a Huffington Post blog saying Donald Trump, ISIS's greatest recruiter. And then I got like 200 really nasty attacks on me. That was very unusual. I later learned about bots as well as Trump, armies online, not to mention Russia. But what do I think? I think Donald Trump fits the stereotypical cult leader profile of malignant narcissism. I was in a cult, Joy. I was recruited at Queens College when I was 19 into a front group of the Moonies cult. And I became basically a right-wing fascist, thinking that democracy was satanic. And Moon said that Black people are talented for basketball and physical education, I might add. And growing up in Queens, it was incredibly integrated, I should add. But Trump is an authoritarian. He is someone who was trained by his father. You are a killer, you are a king. You are a killer, you are a king. And his worldview was very much predator and prey. So he would meet people and think, you know, is this a fellow predator or is this someone that I should take advantage of? So in other words, people are not people. They're objects. It's transactional. No empathy. And he was raised in a cultish group of Norman Vincent Peale, where he was taught to believe 100% in something and then God will manifest it magically. So he was trained to do a technique called thought stopping, which is a behavior modification technique that I was trained in the Moonies to do, to shut off doubts or criticisms, to stay focused on the cult. And I might add, Joy, that I went from fighting with my father, who supported Richard Nixon, and I hated Nixon and thought he was a crook. I went, when I was in the Moonies, to fasting for Nixon for 3 days on the Capitol stairs with other Moonies, because Moon said God wanted Nixon to be president. If it wasn't for a near fatal van crash and then a deprogramming in 1976, I might still be there today, because I was totally indoctrinated into believing this man was the Messiah and that we needed to take over the world.
And that sounds a lot like the way that, you know, I hear people. There's a guy named his last name is Weissman, David Weissman, who he tweets a lot about how he left the belief in Donald Trump, and he describes his own fealty to Trump in much that same way, that he thought, you know, God sent him to be president. There's a lot of religion sort of tied up in it. I wanted to dig
exactly. a little. I actually wrote about David Weissman and how Sarah Silverman actually did a Twitter intervention with him to help him come to his senses and start looking at facts and start to think for himself. And he's actually an inspiration that people can wake up from being fanatical, aside from myself, and why I've dedicated the last 40 plus years of my life as a mental health professional to educating people about mind control cults and teaching people how to help people wake up.
So let's dig just a little bit deeper, and you know, and I want to dig directly into the book, but a little bit more about your background. You know, and I shared with you before we started, you know, that my mother was Guyanese, and you know, at one point Guyana was, you know, invaded by a cult, the Jim Jones cult, and he ultimately killed hundreds of people and himself. When people think of cults, they think of that. They think of somebody who creates a religious type movement. The Waco cult, the Branch Davidians. You know, I have a good friend that was involved in a cult, unfortunately, that she's still involved in, that believed that Waco was actually the center of God's universe, and that, you know, they had to move there and marry whoever they were told to marry. And there's a lot in it, but it's usually religious. How can a political leader be a cult leader when people tend to think of cults as based on religion?
Yeah, I think that the problem is the word cult, and it does bring up, you know, being in a compound or having a shaved head or wearing some type of robe. But in my work, I've helped people involved with cults of personality, where they're taken over by a man or a woman and made to be totally dependent and isolated from their family. I talk about political cults, therapy cults, large group awareness training cults, multi-level marketing cults. And my focus of my work is on psychology, the specific systematic social influence processes that are designed to deceptively recruit people, systematically confuse them, disorient them through overload, through hypnosis, through a whole host of different techniques, and create a pseudo-identity that's then dependent and obedient on the authority figure. So my model that I use is an influence continuum that talks about ethical influence from unethical influence. And it goes into specific behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control components that one can easily identify. This is an authoritarian or destructive mind control group, or just a funky, bohemian cult group. But people know what they're getting into. They can leave easily. They can read whatever they want to read, talk to whoever they want to, have a conscience, have creativity, and have free will.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to show folks who are in the book that this is the influence continuum part of it that you can see here. You lay that out in charts. But let's go through what causes Donald Trump to have this kind of influence. Donald Trump was a failed businessman. He went $900 million in the red. He was never really actually good at the business he inherited, but he made money because banks would lend to him. White privilege has its benefits. So he was able to become rich. We don't know how rich because he lies about his, or he won't let anyone see his taxes. We don't know how rich. We know he got money from somewhere. And then he translated his personality into becoming a TV star, doing The Apprentice, etc. And the question I think for a lot of people is, how did somebody like that is just sort of a wacky TV character convince 60 million people that he should be president of the United States? I mean, he wanted to run 3 times. He threatened to run 2 other times. He finally runs. He wins. How? How did somebody that doesn't seem to have a lot of, let's just be honest, political skill, who isn't respected, who didn't have a real base going in, how did Donald Trump get to the point where he was able to not only convince 60 million people to vote for him, but he has them locked down? How?
So briefly, my thesis is that there are billionaire cult groups out there that have been grooming and indoctrinating and utilizing him. And it's their followers that are largely in his base. And of course, I write about Putin and his intelligence organizations. I talk about a cult called The Family that Jeffrey Charlotte wrote 2 best-selling books about, and Netflix has a series about that Michael Pence is a member of. He was recruited by Charles Colson. Opus Dei, which is a Catholic secretive right-wing cult. I talk about New Apostolic Reformation, which is a series of different Christian-esque groups where the leaders claim to be apostles or prophets and speak in tongues and cast out demons. So anyway, the point is he didn't do it by himself. He's being manipulated and controlled. And there are very powerful forces around the world that want to promote authoritarianism, but cover it and cloak it as popularism. But in fact, they're anti-democratic forces that are against the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and are essentially elitists. And they look at people as objects for their pleasure instead of people with significant intrinsic value as human beings.
So what you're saying is that Donald Trump is essentially a member. He is being led by cult leaders himself?
Yes, that is my thesis. And I think even hearing Putin say once a KGB, always a KGB, and knowing that his job was to recruit and groom and indoctrinate agents for him to control for the Soviet Union and then later for himself. And he has this huge state apparatus with billions of dollars in resources and thousands upon thousands of agents to be deployed. And right now, what's happening as I see it is something called 4th generation psychological operations warfare that's being directed at us, not only online by Russia and probably China and Iran and ISIS and a few other actors, but also within the United States by white supremacists, neo-Nazi groups, other cult groups that have their own agenda and want to destroy women's rights to choose of their own health care, undermine gay rights, and to impose their version of religious freedom, which is to have the freedom to discriminate, to have the freedom to impose their worldview on everyone else. And I believe that real religious freedom respects people's ability to think, to question, to doubt, to read information that differs with it. And so again, I come back to my thesis that this is authoritarian cults that is what's happening. And the good news is people do wake up and realize mind control techniques do exist, and understanding methods of how these organizations operate is the key, I think, to saving our democratic ideals and principles.
Now, you write in The Cult of Trump about the right-wing propaganda ecosystem, the feedback loop that right-wing media creates to help to drive this along, and that you write that it's different from the rest of the media environment. We're thinking, the Fox News is the Breitbarts, how does the right wing
all the right wing things.
How does it work? How does it work, and why is it so powerful? I don't know if you've seen this documentary. I think it's called "How Fox News Stole My Father" or something like that, where it's a guy who
the brainwashing of my dad.
That's it. Yes.
The title of the doc, and it was a very well done documentary. But they missed my former cult, the Moonies, and how the Korean CIA founder said he organized and utilized the Unification Church for use as a political tool, and that the Moonies were brought to the U.S. They set up the Washington Times. They bought UPI. There's a whole right-wing apparatus from my former cult. It's really a very systematic, planned attack on our democracy. And because we don't have an authoritarian dictatorship, it's easy for foreign agents to come in, recruit Americans, set up front groups, and do all kinds of political engineering. And what is so different from the time that I was in a cult, which was the 70s, is the internet exists, cell phones exist, and we just know so much more about how the mind works and how to manipulate people's consciousness. And for example, phobia indoctrination is what I refer to as the universal mind control technique, which is the deliberate implantation of irrational fears that if you question the leader, the doctrine, or the policy, terrible things are going to happen.
Yeah.
And in the mind of someone who's under mind control, they can't imagine leaving the group or the leader and being happy and fulfilled. So for true believers of Trump, they can't imagine if he's not in charge.
Yeah.
All they can imagine is devastation.
Is that what the Antifa obsession is about, in your view?
So it's long understood that if you want to mobilize and control people, create a very vivid enemy or devil figure to make people afraid of. But one of the major techniques that Trump, like other cult leaders, relies on is the whole notion of projection, to blame others for what he's actually doing, to deflect attention from his own misbehavior and direct it to others. But what we really need to do is reality test. And I'm so against people in the media and others who say we live in a post-truth world. I don't agree with that. I think we live in the age of influence. And what's missing is people's understanding of how to discern ethical influence and unethical influence, and what is science and what are beliefs or conspiracy beliefs.
And what would you say to people who say, well, what you're describing there is just political partisanship, and calling it a cult takes it too far? What would you say to people who say that?
I've been accused of being in the cult of Soros and the cult of the New York Times, etc. I'm really not a politician, and I really questioned whether I wanted to do this book when my agent suggested the title, and when Simon and Schuster said they wanted a book called The Cult of Trump. But you have to understand, if you've read my other books or looked at my website, freedomofmind.com, I use the term cult as ethical cults and unethical cults. So, for example, I'm interviewed in a book called The Cult of Mac that came out, I think, of 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I said I only have been using Apple products since 1982, and I have iPhones and iPads and blah, blah, blah. And I'm in that book as a devotee. But the point is freedom, and the freedom to think, the freedom to question and doubt. And whenever somebody, whether it's an authoritarian cult leader or a pundit, says you can't trust anything that is critical against what your position is, warning bells should be going off in people's heads, because this is information control. You know, you're an adult. You should look at the facts and make up your own mind. Listen to critics, listen to former members, think back to before you even heard of Donald Trump. Who were you and what were your values? What did you think about America? What did you think about the Republican Party, for example? And one of the more hopeful things for me is just listening to people who are very virulent Republicans taking on Trump and saying what he's doing is anti-democracy, anti-American values, and saying they'll vote for Biden in order to stop Trump's reelection. That's a hopeful sign for me.
Well, and when people like the Justin Amoshes of the world or the Mitt Romneys, you know, sort of shake out of it, they get punished by the base of the Republican Party. I mean, you know, defying Trump. I mean, I've even heard reporting that Mitch McConnell, by some conservative Republicans in Kentucky, is seen as not loyal enough to Donald Trump. You know, I mean, the reason that your book, and I wanted to interview you, is it's such a powerful way of putting it, because the loyalty to Trump, who again is not he's not Phyllis Schlafly's son or something. You know, he's not someone that they've never thought of. He used to be a Democrat, and now the loyalty to him, you can't even, you know, breathe a single word of criticism. They're terrified. I don't know if you've seen the videos of senators, United States senators, one of the greatest jobs in America. You get $174,000 and your staff does all the work and you go to nice dinners, running away from reporters who are asking, what did you think of Donald Trump? Now his newest one is accusing the 75-year-old man who was knocked down by police of being Antifa. And they run away. They won't even answer. What is that fear about?
So I want to state categorically, Joy, that the average person looks at somebody in a mind control cult and thinks they're stupid, they're uneducated, they're from bad families, they didn't have a religious upbringing. That's not my experience. Intelligent, educated people can be mind controlled, and this very behavior by Republican senators and other politicians just validates my thesis that they're behaving. You know, it's like walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, has feathers like a duck. And when we pull up underneath, it's the DNA of a duck. They're acting like mind control cult members, not independent thinking citizens.
Yeah. And so I guess how much of it, I have a thesis as well about Donald Trump, and then a lot of what drives people to be so loyal to him is demographic panic. It's a fear that non-white people, that Muslims are going to take over America if they don't back someone like him that's a strong man, that can fight back against increasing multiculturalism and women being liberated. And they're going to lose control of not just women, but of the country racially and demographically, and that's part of what drives the loyalty to him. How much of it is that you said it's fear of an other, but what if the other is everyone else who's not a white Christian man? Like, can you form a cult-like loyalty based on fear of everybody?
Sure, 100%. And so what I also want to add, Joy, is that with the personal data scraping by Cambridge Analytica, the Mercers, Peter Thiel, etc. There's so much information about how to personalize ads or how to manipulate specific people, which buttons to push, whether it's anti-abortion, whether it's immigration, whatever, that all these small little cult groups have been formulated. I think Russia had a 5,000 profiles of Americans, that within those 5,000 profiles, they could manipulate the people that they were trying to influence in the election. And it's only getting more sophisticated with AI. So, the whole notion that America is not protecting its citizens' data, and that Facebook is selling it to whoever wants to buy it, is very, very concerning. But again, it comes back to a central thesis that I have in my work, which is that if families who see a loved one get into a cult try to rationally argue with them, tell them, don't be stupid, you're brainwashed, you're in a cult, that's usually going to propel them more deeply in. But if they take a position of, hey, I love you, I respect you, help me understand how you've come to believe what you believe, and if you can convince me, I'll believe it too. If you enter into that kind of reciprocal, respectful frame, we have a chance for millions of people in America to reach out to friends, family, coworkers, and engage them in effective strategic communications aimed at empowering them to think for themselves.
How is that what worked for you? How did you extract yourself from the Moonies?
Wish I could say Steve Hassan existed in the 70s who understood strategic interactive interventions, but it didn't. I fell asleep at the wheel of a van due to sleep deprivation and woke up as I was driving into a tractor trailer truck at 80 miles an hour. And when I was rescued out of that wreckage and in the hospital away from the cult for weeks, I had a feeling to call my sister, who I had cut off contact when I was in the cult, and she persuaded me to come visit. That led to a deprogramming, at first involuntary, and then I wanted to prove to my family I wasn't brainwashed or in a cult. So I agreed to listen for 5 days to a group of ex-Moonies. And when they were teaching me about Chinese communist brainwashing from the 50s and Lifton's 8 criteria, Robert J. Lifton's 8 criteria, it was so obvious that the Moonies were doing all of those. And then I was like, wait a minute, the communists are Satan, we're God, but we're both doing the same brainwashing techniques. And my light started to turn on. And at the point that I woke up and realized, how can I believe in Moon if he's a liar? Like, how could I trust someone who's a liar? That was my wake up moment of fanaticism. And at that moment, it felt like a house of cards was just falling in my head. This total faith that I had been brainwashed to project to Moon as the greatest man in human history started collapsing. And then I was like, how did this happen to me? Which is why I started studying the whole field of psychology.
And as you're saying that, I'm thinking about the fact that, Donald Trump, who in your book is Cult of Trump, has even got a red hat on the front, is already been documented as having told something like 14,000 lies. He lies, I think, approximately 10 times a day. He just makes up sometimes truly bizarre things to lie about, things that you can check. He said that he wasn't hiding in the bunker in the White House, and that he was inspecting it, which is absurd, but his supporters then repeat that and believe it. What will it take? What, in your view, what would it take if somebody has an uncle or a family member who is deeply, deeply devoted to Donald Trump and believes everything he says, even though they know he's done 14,000 lies? What should they say to them? What could they say to them?
So Joe Walsh asked Trump, believers, does Donald Trump lie? And they looked him in the face and said no. I was asked, am I deprogramming? How did I feel when I told lies? And I said, I've never lied. So, I mean, the bottom line is a frontal approach does not work with people who are programmed with behavior, information, thought, and emotional control techniques and mechanisms. But talking about another group, like Chinese communist brainwashing programs, or traffickers and pimps and the techniques they use to groom and indoctrinate people that become their slaves, that creates a frame that Trump supporters will listen to. And then you can get into the bite model and you can explain mind control and social psychology techniques, etc. And then kind of back your way into the idea that, you know, if you're so sure that you're following a healthy, good person, why not talk to critics? Why not talk to ex-members? Why not think back to what you believed before you even knew he existed and how you came to be where you are today? And ask yourself the question, if I knew then what I know now, would I have ever voted for him? Would I have ever contributed to that campaign? And if the answer is no way, then even though you've been a devoted follower for years, time to leave. You know, why stay involved with something that isn't fulfilling your values and what you thought was going to happen?
Yeah, because I think what's confounding for a lot of people is that you'll have people who, you know, call themselves Christians, and it says very clearly, you know, in the Bible that you're supposed to care for the stranger and the widow and the orphan, but they're against, you know, money going to the poor. They're against kindness toward immigrants. They want immigrants locked up. They like the fact that they're in cages. It is odd to watch people perform the opposite of their values for this man when he's giving them nothing. I mean, we have, you know, millions of people with COVID and, you know, 105,000 dead. It is fascinating that you look at it. Do you think that there's something about American culture that makes Americans more susceptible to cults than other people?
That's a good question. I do want to comment that whenever there's a very big upheaval, economic upheaval, like a pandemic, people get even more susceptible to conspiracy theories and other cult groups that will come in and try to present a coherent, you know, simplistic binary thing, and so people are being recruited left and right.
Oh, you mean like the 5G theory? I mean, there are people who really literally think
that's just 5G. One. The 9/11 truthers, the birther myths. I mean, there's so many different things, but the number one preventative is education about how the mind works and how social psychology works and how to protect yourself and not just allow yourself to be swayed. And so there's a wonderful project by one of my my mentors, Philip Zimbardo, called the Heroic Imagination Project. And on his website, he has little video clips of important social psychology experiments with a curriculum that people can go through that will teach them, hey, you know what? Human beings are biological, social creatures, and we depend on information, and our brain is filtering it according to whatever beliefs are happening at the moment. And what's so tricky about cult brainwashing is that it's considered in the mental health field as a dissociative disorder. So to explain it simply for your listeners, it's like there was the Steve Hassan, who was a creative writing major at Queens College and wrote poetry, and the Steve Hassan, who was son of Sun Myung Moon and Hak Trahan, the true parents of the universe. And it was the cult identity that suppressed my real identity, told him to throw out his poetry, and that we have to take over the world for Moon. So to understand that the real me didn't get erased, it got suppressed, and that in the right conditions, my family was able to empower me to back to my values and to think analytically about what it was that I was doing and whether or not it actually was what I thought it was supposed to be.
And so do you think Americans are more susceptible to this?
I think everyone is susceptible to it. I think in particular, we are a culture, as I write about in my book, where Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who wrote the 1928 book Propaganda, He's the first one to connect political campaigns and business with psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And it was his whole formulation that Goebbels used in the Hitler Nazi campaign as well. This knowledge has been promulgated, dispensed to corporations throughout our country to get people to buy things that they don't know and they don't even need, but to make them believe that they need it. And it's that kind of mentality of, oh, it's on TV, it must be true. You know, the ad says it. How could they be lying? And what we've come to learn is, no, there's actually, without having independent checks on things, there's a lot of deception and corruption going on because of the money and the power.
That's a good point. That, you know, advertising, as you said, is sort of the ultimate kind of cult recruitment, because it'll get you to buy something, and then you were like, well, a few months later, why did I buy that? I didn't even need it. Let me ask you, as I'm running out of time with you, the George Floyd protests that we've seen around the country, really around the world, for a lot of white Americans were a wake-up call. You know, even people I know who, you know, consider themselves, you know, quite liberal are constantly texting me about how this is something about this case has changed everything that they think about policing and about the Black experience in America. Do you think that a profound traumatic event like this, like the killing on tape of a man, of a Black man in Minneapolis, and now all of the agony that it's caused and all the protests that it's caused, are those the kind of events that might shake people out of even the cult of Trump? Yeah,
absolutely. And I want to say that I went on a limb. I think it's a limb of a sort to write a blog about George Floyd on my website, where I connected the dots with slavery itself and slave owners. Mm-hmm. And I'm taking the bite model, adding kidnapping, lynching, rape, you know, murder, to the regular, normal, if that's a right term, of mind control techniques. And if you have that frame and you think back that this has been happening in our country for hundreds of years, it provides a real framework to go, whoa, you know, like my ancestors were in a shtetl in Latvia, but the Native Americans were decimated by the colonialists. There's a wonderful documentary called Dawnland about how Native American Indians were being taken from their families to be raised as Christians. And this was, you know, the whole frame of understanding ethical versus unethical influence with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a core value document is what I think is going to offer people an explanatory framework for what's happening, why things have gone badly, and where we need to aspire to turn this country around.
Do you understand, from, you know, coming from a background as a Jewish man, as a Jewish American yourself, can you understand how somebody like a Stephen Miller could wind up embedded with somebody like Donald Trump, who has said that neo-Nazis, you know, who marched in Charlottesville had good people among them, and who has, you know, cuddled up to the alt-right, which is very much, as you said, they go on about George Soros. They're globalist. It's very anti-Jewish. It's very, you know, it cuddles up to that element, that the farthest of the far right. And it's weird to see a young Jewish man be a part of that. Do you find that odd?
Guilty. When I was in the Moon cult, I was so indoctrinated when Moon said that the Holocaust needed to happen because the Jews didn't accept Jesus. I believed it.
Wow.
When Moon said that Jews have lost their mission and the new Israel is Korea and Koreans are the master race, I went right along with it because I was so programmed to believe him as the ultimate authority on earth, and I was taught thought-stopping techniques. Joy, I was brought to see the Exorcist movie by the Moonies And Moon said, God made this movie. It's a prophecy of what will happen if you leave the Unification Church.
Wow.
And I didn't believe in evil spirits or Satan growing up.
Yeah.
But they put this in my head, and it became my operating system of belief. So I can believe in the why Stephen Miller is being what he is.
Yeah.
And I do think he can wake up. And I'm really the wounded healer, like if this didn't happen to me, I'd never believe somebody could be made into a mind control person who worked 18 to 21 hours a day, 7 days a week, cut off from family, drop out of college, donate the bank account, and become a right-wing fascist.
It is quite amazing. Well, given all that you've experienced yourself and all that you've seen, I have to ask you, Steven Hassan, are you optimistic about the future? Are you optimistic about where things might go from here?
I'm guardedly optimistic because so many good people oppose authoritarianism and Trump. What I worry about is that we know that he craves power. He knows he's going to be arrested for so many criminal things once he's no longer president. And I worry about a false flag incident, which is where, for example, Putin took power when he had some of his agents do a bombing in Russia and blamed it on the Chechens. My worry is that he'll do something horrible and then declare martial law. My biggest hope is that military people are speaking out very strongly. General Mattis and Admiral Stavridis and John Kelly, other people,
even Colin Powell
are speaking out. So in that way, I'm hopeful, but we have to understand he's going to cheat. They're going to do a lot of dirty stuff. And the big hope for me is mass education, that everyone comes to understand what manipulation is about.
And are you worried that if Donald Trump does lose to Joe Biden, which will be a humiliation for him, he'll clearly be enraged by it. I mean, he's enraged by bad poll numbers. Are you worried about what he will call on his, furthest out there followers to do?
I think we should count on it, honestly. I mean, I wrote about him in Cult of Trump that Alex Jones did over 1,000 RT stories on his channel, and many of them went to Breitbart and then to Fox. And he's been calling for civil war and arms, to kill your neighbors. He was even saying he was going to eat his neighbors if he's hungry.
What?
This mentality has been communicated over the media of the right wing. And even if Trump's out, this media is going to continue. Trumpism is going to continue. And people like Putin want chaos. They want to diminish America's prestige and power in the world. And so, again, we have to come back to what kind of world do we want to have and what kind of country do we want to live in? And bringing good people together, educating them and figuring out together how to preserve our institutions like elections. I don't know if you saw the Kill Chain documentary on HBO, all about election fraud. That's a point of very big concern for me.
It absolutely is. But Steven Hassan, you're fascinating. This is a really, really fascinating book, The Cult of Trump. A leading cult expert explains how the president uses mind control. I'm now going to dig into speaking of what to read, I'm going to be digging into your other two books, your previous book, Combating Cult Mind Control, Freedom of Mind, which is the most famous book by you. Sir, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk about the book, and best of luck with it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Joy.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you so much to Steven Hassan. fascinating book, The Cult of Trump. A leading cult expert explains how the president uses mind control. This is a really fascinating topic.
That was a great interview.
Thank you very much. And he hasn't done a lot of interviews because there is a resistance to talking about Donald Trump in this way. But I love that he wrote this book. And I'm going to read all these previous books too. Freedom of Mind, which is the really famous book. I think it was a New York Times #1 bestseller. It was a bestseller in any event. And he is considered the leading cult expert in the United States. Fascinating too about himself even having been involved in a cult himself. And he has another book called Combating Cult Mind Control. Thank you very much to Steven Hassan. Thank all of you for checking out What to Read. It's always a pleasure. Please be sure to tell us what you think of it. Throw some comments below. We love the comments. Hit the little alarm bell thing. There's like an alarm bell.
It's called notification.
Oh, it's called notification. There you go. See, I don't know the sophisticated term for it, but if you hit the notifications button, you will never miss another episode of What to Read. And why would you want to miss an episode of What to Read? You don't want to miss that. You also want to share. Please share it on Twitter, share it on your Facebook, share it on, make a TikTok about us. Go on. Don't, feel free. Don't restrain yourself. Go ahead. Share it on your Instagrams, everything. So share.
You can also download the podcast wherever you get your podcast.
There you go. Download it wherever you get your podcast. If you just want to listen and you don't want to have to see my fabulous beat. It's not really a beat because I did it myself.
It's beautiful.
It's not considered. Oh, thank you. It's not considered a beat,
beautiful.
But you know what I mean. I'm doing the best I can with no professional hair and makeup. So if you don't want to see, you just want to hear, you can download it wherever you get your podcast. You can always do that. We've got so many good guests coming up, and we're just going to keep bringing them to you because we love books. We love you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next What to Read.
Bye, fam.
Bye.
I'm keeping up. I want to tag along.